I used to believe that by the time a man reached 70, life had finished teaching him its lessons. I was wrong, very wrong. The truth is, life saved its most important lesson for last and delivered it in the smallest hands I had ever held. I was sitting on the porch that afternoon, the same way I had for years. Same wooden chair, same chipped mug of tea that had gone cold before I ever finished it. Same quiet street where nothing ever seemed to change anymore. The world had slowed down for me. Or perhaps I had slowed down for it. Either way, we had reached an understanding. I would watch, and it would pass me by. That was before Eli arrived. My grandson. He was 5 years old the first time I truly noticed him. Not the polite hellos or shy waves before that, but the moment he became real to me. Before then, he had simply been there, a small blur of noise and movement that visited occasionally with my daughter. I loved him, of course, but from a distance, the way old men sometimes love, careful, quiet, unsure of how to step into a child's world. That afternoon, he came running up the porch steps like he owned the place. "Grandpa," he shouted, breathless, "why do you always sit out here?" I looked at him, surprised by the directness. Children have a way of asking the questions adults spend years avoiding. "I like the quiet," I said. He frowned, deep in thought. "But it's boring." I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I shrugged. "Quiet lets you think." He tilted his head. "Why do you need to think?" That question stayed with me longer than I expected. Because I had no good answer. Before Eli, my days were predictable. Wake up early, make coffee, sit by the window, watch the same neighbor leave at the same time every morning, count the cars, listen to the ticking clock, wait for the day to end. After my wife passed, silence became my companion. Not a comforting one, but a familiar one. It filled the rooms, settled into the corners of the house, and wrapped itself around me at night. I told myself I liked it, that I had earned it. But Eli didn't understand silence. He filled it with questions, with laughter, with messes, with life. He started coming over every Saturday when my daughter needed help. At first, I didn't know what to do with him. He moved too fast, talked too much, asked too many questions. I had forgotten how loud joy could be. One afternoon, I found him sitting on the floor, surrounded by old photo albums I hadn't opened in years. "Who's this?" he asked, pointing at a picture of a younger me standing beside a woman with bright eyes and a wide smile. "That's your grandmother," I said. He studied the photo carefully. "She looks happy." She was. "Why aren't you smiling like that now?" The question hit harder than I expected. I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. He looked at me for a moment longer, then said something that would stay with me for years. "Maybe you forgot how." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that photograph, about the man I used to be, about how somewhere along the way, I had stopped smiling without realizing it. Not because life had been cruel, but because I had allowed it to become small. The next morning, Eli arrived with a red ball under his arm. "Come play with me," he said. "I don't play anymore," I replied. He stared at me like I had said something ridiculous. That's sad. There was no cruelty in his voice, just honesty, and somehow, that made it worse. Still, I followed him into the yard. He threw the ball toward me. It rolled past my feet. "You're supposed to catch it," he said. I bent down slowly, my knees protesting, and picked it up. When I tossed it back, it went wide, bouncing into the bushes. Eli laughed. A full, unrestrained laugh. "That was a bad throw," he said cheerfully. "I know. Try again." So I did. And again. And again. Until I was laughing too. I hadn't laughed like that in years. Over time, Saturdays became something I looked forward to. Eli taught me how to see the world again, not as a series of routines, but as a place full of small wonders. Ants carrying crumbs bigger than themselves. Clouds shaped like animals. The magic of finding a shiny rock on the sidewalk. Once, while we were walking to the park, he stopped suddenly and pointed at a tree. "Listen," he whispered. I stood still. "I don't hear anything." "Exactly," he said. "It's peaceful." I realized then that he understood quiet better than I ever had. Not the empty kind, the full kind. One afternoon, while we were drawing at the table, he asked, "Grandpa, were you scared when you were little?" "All the time," I admitted. "Of what?" "Of making mistakes." He thought about that. "But mistakes help you learn." I smiled. "That's what they say." He looked at me seriously. "Then why do grown-ups try so hard not to make them?" That question sat in my chest like a stone. "Because we're afraid," I thought. afraid of looking foolish, afraid of failing, afraid of starting over. But I didn't say that. Instead, I said, maybe we forget how important they are. He nodded, satisfied, then went back to coloring outside the lines. The real lesson came one rainy afternoon. We were stuck inside, the sky heavy and gray. Eli sat by the window, staring out quietly. "What's wrong?" I asked. "I'm sad," he said. "Why?" "Because today is over. And I didn't do everything I wanted." I almost laughed at the innocence of it. Almost. But then I realized something. I had felt the same way for years, just in a quieter way. So I sat beside him and said, "That happens sometimes." He nodded slowly. "Then tomorrow we try again." Something inside me shifted. So simple, so true, so easy to forget. That night, after he left, I sat alone in the house. The silence returned, but it felt different now. Lighter, less heavy. I realized that without meaning to, my grandson had begun teaching me things I thought I already knew. How to notice, how to laugh, how to begin again, and most importantly, how to live in the moment, not the memory. I looked at the empty chair across from me and smiled. Because for the first time in a long while, I wasn't waiting for the day to end. I was waiting for tomorrow. He stopped suddenly and looked up at me. "Grandpa." "Yes, buddy." "Do people disappear forever when they die?" The room felt quieter than it had a moment before. I lowered my book slowly. Children have a way of asking the biggest questions without warning, as if they're asking about the weather or what's for dinner. No preparation, no hesitation, just truth. I cleared my throat. "Why do you ask that?" He shrugged. "My friend at school said his grandpa went to heaven, but he's not coming back." "Is that true?" I stared at the window, watching rain slide down the glass. For a moment, I considered giving him the kind of answer adults often give, soft, vague, carefully wrapped. Something about angels or stars or sleeping peacefully. But something told me not to. "Sometimes," I said slowly, "people don't come back the way we want them to." He thought about that. Then he asked the question that truly undid me. "Are you going to disappear too?" I felt it then. The ache, the quiet fear I had been carrying without realizing it. I reached out and pulled him closer. He was warm, alive, breathing. His head fit perfectly against my chest. "Not for a long time," I said. "And even when I do, I'll still be with you." He looked up. "How?" I tapped his chest gently. "Right there." He seemed satisfied with that answer. I wasn't. That night, after Eli had gone home, I couldn't stop thinking about the question, am I going to disappear? The truth was, I had already begun to feel invisible long before age made it official. Friends had passed. My wife was gone. Conversations had grown shorter, visits less frequent. The world had moved forward, and I had stayed still. But Eli didn't see me that way. To him, I was not a fading memory. I was present. I was important. I was needed. And that realization frightened me more than death ever had. The following weekend, Eli arrived with a small backpack and a serious expression. "I brought snacks," he said, "in case we get hungry." "We're not going anywhere," I said, amused. "I know," he replied, "but you always say it's good to be prepared." I smiled. He was listening more than I realized. We sat at the kitchen table eating crackers when he suddenly asked, "Grandpa, what did you want to be when you were my age?" I paused. No one had asked me that in decades. "I wanted to be a painter," I said. His eyes lit up. "Really?" "Yes. I used to draw all the time." "Why didn't you?" I hesitated. "Because life happened. Because responsibility came first. Because dreams felt childish. Because fear was louder than hope. I got busy," I said finally. He considered that. Then he said, "That sounds sad." It was, and I had never admitted it out loud before. He jumped up from his chair and ran to his backpack, pulling out a small box of crayons. He placed them on the table in front of me like a gift. "Then you can start again." I laughed. "I'm too old." He frowned. "You said people don't disappear if they're still here." I had no answer for that. So I picked up a crayon. We spent the afternoon drawing. My hands were stiff, the lines uneven, but something inside me loosened. I drew a tree, a house, a man sitting on a bench. Eli drew monsters, cars, and something that looked like a flying sandwich. At one point, he held up my drawing and smiled. "That's good, Grandpa." It wasn't, but it didn't matter. What mattered was how I felt. Alive, engaged, present. That night, after he left, I taped the drawing to the fridge. It stayed there for months. Weeks passed, and our conversations grew deeper. One afternoon, he asked, "Do you miss Grandma a lot?" I nodded. "Every day. Does it still hurt?" "Yes," I said, "but not the same way." "How?" I thought carefully before answering. "It hurts like a memory instead of a wound." He nodded, as if that made perfect sense. Then he said, "I think she'd like me." I smiled. "She would have loved you." He grinned proudly. "I think so too." We sat quietly for a while, the room filled with something warm and unspoken. Then he said, "You know, Grandpa, I think you're lonely." The honesty of children is both beautiful and brutal. I said softly. He reached over and took my hand. "You don't have to be anymore." And just like that, something shifted. It was around that time that I started changing without realizing it. I began waking up earlier, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I started taking walks again, noticing the way the sun hit the sidewalk, the way the air smelled after rain. I even started talking to neighbors I had avoided for years. All because one small boy had reminded me that life wasn't over just because it had slowed down. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sky turn orange, Eli asked, "Grandpa, are you scared of dying?" I thought for a long moment. "I used to be," I said, "but not as much anymore." "Why not?" "Because I realized something." "What?" "That what matters most isn't how long you live, it's what you leave behind." He nodded slowly. "Like memories?" "Yes," I said. "And love." He leaned against me, sleepy. "Then you're doing okay." Those words stayed with me. Later that night, after he had gone home, I stood in the quiet house and looked around. The walls no longer felt empty. The silence no longer felt heavy. I understood something then. My grandson hadn't just brought noise and energy back into my life. He had brought meaning. He had reminded me that life doesn't end when we grow old. It changes shape. That wisdom isn't about knowing everything, but about being willing to learn again. That love doesn't fade, it transforms. And most importantly, that it's never too late to start living again. There are moments in life that arrive quietly, without warning, yet change everything. For me, it happened on a Tuesday afternoon, when the house was too quiet and my heart felt heavier than usual. Eli hadn't come over that week. My daughter had called to say he had a cold and needed rest. I understood, of course, but the silence he left behind felt louder than I expected. I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from me. That was when I realized something unsettling. I had been living my life looking backward for so long that I had forgotten how to live forward. The memories were always there. My wife's laughter, the years when my children were small, the dreams I never chased. I had carried them carefully, like fragile glass, afraid that letting go would mean losing them forever. But maybe holding on so tightly was what had been keeping me stuck. Underscore. That afternoon, I found myself standing in front of a closet I hadn't opened in years. Inside were old boxes, neatly stacked and untouched. I pulled one down, the cardboard worn soft with age. Inside were photographs, letters, and things I thought I had lost. At the very bottom was a small bundle tied with string. Letters. My wife's handwriting. I sat down slowly, the box trembling in my hands. The first letter was dated over 40 years ago. I recognized it instantly. She had written it during a time when we were young and uncertain, when life felt like a question without an answer. I unfolded the paper carefully. If you ever read this, it means I didn't say everything I should have. My chest tightened. I had never opened these letters before. I told myself it was because I wasn't ready. The truth was, I was afraid of what they would make me feel. But now, with Eli in my life, something had changed. I began to read. The letters were not dramatic. There were no grand declarations or poetic speeches. They were simple, honest, full of everyday love. She wrote about her fears, her hopes, her worries about the future. She wrote about me, how quiet I was, how deeply I felt things, how she sometimes wished I would say more instead of holding everything inside. One line stopped me cold. "I know you love me, but I wish you'd let yourself live a little more. Life is shorter than we think." I set the letter down, my hands shaking. She had known. She had always known. And I had spent years thinking I was being careful, when really, I was being afraid. That night, I cried for the first time in a long while. Not the quiet kind of crying that sneaks up on you. The kind that shakes your chest. and leaves you exhausted. And when it passed, something else took its place. Relief. The next time Eli came over, he noticed immediately. "You look different," he said. "How so?" "Happier," he replied. "And kind of sad, too." I smiled. "That's a good way to be sometimes." He nodded like he understood. We sat together on the porch, watching the clouds drift slowly across the sky. "Grandpa," he said, "do you think people get second chances?" I thought about the letters, the years I had spent holding back, the way life had surprised me lately. "I think," I said carefully, "that people get as many chances as they're willing to take." He smiled. "Good, because I think you're taking one." Not long after that, I did something I hadn't done in years. I visited my wife's grave. I used to avoid it. It felt too final, too heavy. But this time was different. I brought flowers. I brought the letters. And I brought words I had held inside for far too long. I told her about Eli, about how he laughed, about how he asked questions that made me uncomfortable, about how he reminded me of her, in the way he saw the world with open eyes and an open heart. I told her I was sorry for the moments I had been distant, for the love I hadn't always shown clearly enough, for the life I had spent waiting instead of living. And then, for the first time, I said goodbye properly, not with sadness, but with gratitude. When I came home, I felt lighter. The house felt different too, less like a place of memories, more like a place of living. That evening, Eli called me. "Grandpa, Mom says you're coming to my school thing tomorrow." "I am," I said. "You've never come before." "I know." "Why now?" I smiled. "Because I don't want to miss things anymore." There was a pause. Then he said, "I'm glad." So was I. The school auditorium was loud and crowded, filled with parents and grandparents holding phones and whispering. I sat in the second row, heart pounding like I was the one about to go on stage. When Eli walked out, scanning the crowd, his face lit up when he saw me. He waved so hard I thought his arm might fall off. And in that moment, I understood something deeply. Being present mattered more than being perfect. After the show, he ran to me, breathless. "Did you see me?" "I saw everything, even when I forgot my line. Especially that part." He laughed. "I was scared. You did great anyway." He looked at me seriously. "That's what you do, right? You do things even when you're scared." I swallowed. "Yes," I said. "That's exactly what you do." I told her about Eli, about how he laughed, about how he asked questions that made me uncomfortable, about how he reminded me of her, in the way he saw the world with open eyes and an open heart. I told her I was sorry for the moments I had been distant, for the love I hadn't always shown clearly enough, for the life I had spent waiting instead of living. And then, for the first time, I said goodbye properly, not with sadness, but with gratitude. When I came home, I felt lighter. The house felt different too, less like a place of memories, more like a place of living. That evening, Eli called me. "Grandpa, Mom says you're coming to my school thing tomorrow." "I am," I said. "You've never come before." "I know." "Why now?" I smiled. "Because I don't want to miss things anymore." There was a pause. Then he said, "I'm glad." So was I. The school auditorium was loud and crowded, filled with parents and grandparents holding phones and whispering. I sat in the second row, heart pounding like I was the one about to go on stage. When Eli walked out, scanning the crowd, his face lit up when he saw me. He waved so hard I thought his arm might fall off. And in that moment, I understood something deeply. Being present mattered more than being perfect. After the show, he ran to me, breathless. "Did you see me?" "I saw everything, even when I forgot my line. Especially that part." He laughed. "I was scared. You did great anyway." He looked at me seriously. "That's what you do, right? You do things even when you're scared." I swallowed. "Yes," I said. "That's exactly what you do." That afternoon, we took a walk through the neighborhood. The same streets I had walked for decades now felt different. Not new, just clearer. As if I were seeing them without the fog of regret that had once clouded everything. Eli skipped ahead, stopping every few steps to examine something new. "Look," he said, pointing to a crack in the sidewalk where a tiny plant had grown through. "How does that happen?" he asked. "It finds a way," I replied. He smiled. "I like that." So did I. Because suddenly, that tiny plant felt like a metaphor for my life. Even after years of pressure, loss, and stillness, something had found a way to grow again. That evening, after my daughter came to pick him up, Eli hugged me tightly. "Don't forget to be happy, Grandpa," he said. I laughed. "I'll try." "No," he said seriously. "Promise." I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I promise." After they left, I stood in the doorway for a long time, the echo of his voice still hanging in the air, and I realized something profound. Happiness wasn't something I had lost. It was something I had stopped choosing. The following weeks brought quiet changes. I started waking up earlier, not because I had to, but because I wanted to watch the sunrise. I began cooking again instead of reheating meals. I started calling old friends. Some answered, some didn't, and that was okay. I even picked up a sketchbook, the same way I had when I was young. My hands weren't as steady, but my heart was. And every time doubt crept in, I thought of Eli's words. "Then you can start again." One evening, while sorting through old things, I found a photo of myself as a young man, full of hope, full of plans. I placed it next to a newer photo, one of me and Eli, smiling, sitting on the porch. The contrast made me pause. I finally understood something I had missed my entire life. We don't lose ourselves as we age. We find ourselves again in different ways. A few months later, Eli asked me to come to his school for a presentation called My Hero. I laughed. "You have lots of heroes." "I picked you," he said simply. The room was filled with parents and grandparents. Children stood proudly beside their posters. When it was Eli's turn, he held up a picture he had drawn. It was of us, sitting on the porch. "This is my grandpa," he said. "He's my hero because he listens, and he learned how to be happy again." The room went quiet. I felt my throat tighten. "He taught me that it's okay to be scared," Eli continued, "and that you should still try, and that love doesn't go away, even when people do." I couldn't speak. I just stood there, heart full, eyes burning, understanding at last the depth of what he had given me. That night, I sat alone with a cup of tea, looking at the stars. For the first time in many years, I wasn't thinking about how much time I had left. I was thinking about how I wanted to spend it. I understood now that life isn't about holding on to the past or fearing the end. It's about showing up, being present, loving deeply, and passing on what matters. Eli hadn't just changed my days. He had changed my direction. If there is one thing my grandson taught me, it's this. Life doesn't stop teaching you just because your hair turns gray. Sometimes, the greatest teacher arrives in the smallest form. Sometimes, wisdom comes not from age, but from innocence. And sometimes, the greatest lesson of all is learning how to live again, right when you think it's too late.